It's time to get serious about nonsense with this week's mini lecture on Chapter 9 Ill Tempered and Queer Sense and Nonsense from Victorian to Modern. In this chapter, Lara walks us through about 200 years of the legacy of nonsense literature, starting with the Victorians. So, the Victorian era refers specifically to a period of time from 1837 to 1901, which marked the reign of Queen Victoria in England. And there's some really popular images, probably, that are enduring from this time period. The clothing, for one thing, right? Corsets, bustles, really elaborate hairstyles and gowns. But above all, I think what stands out from the Victorian era is this insistence on order. There were really strict social conventions of propriety when it came to so many different arenas. Certainly highly prescribed modes of dress, but beyond that, behavior and etiquette as well for pretty much every corner of a person's life. Alongside this were very rigid hierarchies of both class and gender expectations. So the corset is more than just a restrictive piece of clothing. It's almost a metaphor for the way that society itself had a lot of constricting influence on the everyday person. So, perhaps unsurprisingly, Lehrer argues, this is also a time where we really see popular literature resisting and transgressing the accepted order through nonsense. There's almost an equal and opposite reaction in the arts to the expectations of society. Lehrer makes the claim on page 191 that the idea of nonsense as a force of the imagination, of nonsense as a challenge to the logic of adulthood and the laws of civil life, this was a new idea in Victorian England. What better time, right? And we can see this idea of literary nonsense bearing fruit not just in the content of authors who sort of use departures from reality, but in the texture of language itself, actually. Linguistic nonsense was a way of being playful with language. Its structure, its sound, authors were performing an act of rebellion of sorts. And this was not just idle silliness, it actually gave way to real social commentary and satire. Lehrer elaborates on page 191 that authors were trying to open verbal doors to come up with new words and strange sounds, and nobody was a bigger fan of this than Lewis Carroll, the author of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Lewis Carroll was truly devoted to nonsense, you might say. We can see this in the content of his novels with fanciful characters and landscapes, Mad Hatters, talking Cheshire cats, but it's seen in the technical aspects of his writing as well. We've got this great quote from Lewis Carroll included on page 193, and it comes across as a bit of a manifesto of sorts. He says, I maintain that any writer of a book is fully authorized in attaching any meaning he likes to any word or phrase he intends to use. This is somewhat of a declaration on the right of authors to reassign meaning itself. In linguistic terms, you might say that Carroll wanted to loosen the relationship between the signifier and the signified. This is evident in his use of frequent portmanteaus, which are also known as combining previously existing words to create a new meaning. And a really famous example of this type of wordplay comes in his poem, The Jabberwocky, which is featured in Through the Looking Glass. Lehrer says that language is in some sense a game for Carroll, and we can certainly see that in the Jabberwocky. The opening stanza, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogoves, and the mome-raths outgrabe." It's essentially word salad. We have all of these novel, invented terms, but they come together to make their own sort of syntactic sense in a weird way. There's a sense of story nonetheless. Carroll's playing around with this form of epic poetry with the Jabberwocky, but he's doing so completely on his own terms, which is subversive and delightful to the Victorians, and by all accounts, quite queer. Lehrer talks about queerness in Chapter 9 as a term that points to a challenge of the accepted order, that which is left of center or outside the common expectation and boundaries. He says on page 195 that queer comes from a term that originally meant off-center, diagonal, or askew. And it's interesting to note the double valence of the word queer to sort of denote homosexual experience comes later on in the 1920s. So that's not a meaning that readers at the time would have attached to it, but queerness is certainly central to understanding Lewis Carroll's kind of wonderland aesthetic of children's literature in general. A bit of a tilt, if you will, in perspective that kind of diverts from your expectations. And is this not, I think, indicative of a child's perspective in general of the world, sort of seen through the looking glass? We have the Victorian forebears of literary nonsense to thank for quite a few aspects, actually, that we see carried through in the legacy of modern children's literature. One aspect of this legacy is privileging the child's point of view and really presenting adults as the ones who are unusual and startling in their behavior. Lehrer is interested particularly in the illustrator and poet Edward Lear. He was most famous for his illustrations and limericks that were kind of rude or off color and held this certain subversion of the civil order, as he puts it on page 199. The limericks often started out, "There was an old man," and go on from there to describe some character who we see violating convention or propriety in one way or another. These limericks had a way of holding adults up for ridicule and critiquing their behavior, making them the ones who were out of step with reality. Another aspect of more contemporary children's literature that Lehrer says we can thank the Victorians for is the sort of common trope of traveling to faraway imaginary lands where the rules of society can't reach us. Authors for children were playing around with this idea of geographical escape, not only from imperialism, but from the conventions that bind us. Alice's journey through the looking glass is certainly a good example of this, but Lehrer traces these impulses all the way up to stories such as The Little Prince, Where the Wild Things Are, to art movements like the avant-garde Dadaists, but he is particularly interested in Shel Silverstein. Lehrer refers to Silverstein on page 206 as sort of this modern heir to the upside-down world of nonsense literature. And he's an author who embraces the absurd, who points out the strangeness of adult conventions of behavior. He really gives us a world where kids are right. Silverstein's poetry and art really embodies so many of these conventions of nonsense that kind of started with the Victorians, but he's extraordinarily sympathetic towards children. He wants to free them from conventionality and not vilify their desires. And perhaps one of Silverstein's most enduring works is Where the Sidewalk Ends, which is the titular poem of his 1974 collection. That really sets us loose on a new frontier. It gives us a place where patterned behavior is not required and we can defy expectation. The imagery itself of where the sidewalk ends sort of suggests, the ceasing of the official guidelines, right? As the poem says, it's where the sun burns crimson bright and the moonbird rests from his flight to cool in the peppermint wind. There's really this idea of kind of finding the beauty in the end of the beaten path. A sort of fantasy for children who are tired of being told to maintain to a tightly prescribed world. Silverstein's work is filled with so much yearning for this kind of freedom, and I think it's something we can kind of see throughout the poems in the collection. All right, that's all I've got for now. I'm going to set you free to do your own work of analysis, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say this week.